Michael Jordan's challenge in court. Michael Jordan, the name synonymous with basketball excellence, was no stranger to the spotlight. But today the famed athlete found himself in an unfamiliar environment, a courtroom, where the rules were not those of the basketball court, but the harsh, impartial laws of the land. However, it wasn't a criminal case, nor a sports dispute that brought him here. It was the act of wearing his cherished basketball shoes. The shoes. Those very same ones that had carried him through championship games and victories, now became the center of controversy. To some, they were a symbol of success, resilience, and a journey filled with determination and triumph. To others, they were just shoes, nothing more than a piece of clothing. But to Judge Samuel Hawthorne, they were an affront to the decorum of his courtroom, a disruption, a challenge to the authority he commanded. The court was filled with hushed whispers as Michael stepped forward, his tall frame cutting through the heavy atmosphere. As he walked toward the bench, his basketball shoes squeaked against the polished wooden floor. They were more than just footwear to Michael. They were a reminder of where he had come from and the challenges he had faced in his rise to greatness. They carried with them memories of late-night practices, endless hours of dedication, and the sheer will to push through adversity. Judge Hawthorne, a man of rigid tradition, couldn't understand what these shoes represented. To him, they were out of place. His courtroom, a place of order and seriousness, could not be disturbed by something as frivolous as a pair of shoes, especially those that had so deeply connected Michael to a world outside the legal realm. "You are in contempt of this court, Mr. Jordan," the judge's voice boomed, cutting through the silence of the room. "You will remove those shoes immediately or face the consequences." The crowd held its breath, unsure of how this famous figure would respond to the harsh words of a man who seemed bent on asserting his authority. But Michael, with a calm that only came from years of experience facing down intense pressure, stood firm. He didn't flinch, didn't rush to defend himself. Instead, he made the decision that would forever change the trajectory of this courtroom moment. He would not back down. "I'm Michael Jordan," he began, his voice clear and steady. "These shoes are a part of me, a part of my journey, a symbol of the battles I've fought, the sacrifices I've made, and the person I am today. I have every right to wear them here." In that moment, the crowd in the courtroom could feel the weight of his words. What seemed like a trivial matter, a pair of shoes, was transforming into something much deeper. It wasn't about footwear. It was about the essence of who Michael was and what he stood for. It was a challenge not just to the judge, but to the system itself. He wasn't just a basketball player. He was a man who understood the value of self-representation, the importance of standing up for what was right, and the power of defending personal beliefs, no matter how seemingly insignificant they appeared in the grand scheme of things. The law, after all, was not just about rules. It was about fairness, equality, and protecting the freedoms that everyone should have. Freedoms that, on this day, Michael was prepared to defend with everything he had, standing for rights and the First Amendment. As the gavel came crashing down, Michael Jordan stood before Judge Samuel Hawthorne with unwavering composure, despite the weight of the situation. In that charged moment, Michael realized this wasn't just about basketball shoes anymore. It was about something much more significant. It was about standing up for his rights and defending the very principles of freedom that were supposed to guide a nation founded on justice. The judge's words echoed in the courtroom. Contempt of court, $500 fine for wearing inappropriate attire. His face flushed red, and his voice carried the weight of authority, expecting Michael to simply accept the ruling. However, Michael was no stranger to challenges. He had faced them time and again in his basketball career, battling not just opponents but the odds stacked against him. Now he found himself facing a different kind of battle, a battle for freedom, for personal expression, and for the right to exist in a space without fear of discrimination or undue punishment. Michael had always believed in the power of the First Amendment, but now he would have to demonstrate that belief in the face of an unjust ruling. The words of the Constitution rang in his ears, reminding him that it wasn't just about religion or freedom of speech. It was about the inherent right to express oneself. The First Amendment was designed to ensure that no one could be silenced for what they believed, what they wore, or how they chose to represent themselves. Judge Hawthorne's decision was not just an attack on Michael's choice of footwear, it was an affront to the very notion of personal freedom. To the judge, the shoes were an eyesore, a disruption in the serious and orderly courtroom. But to Michael, they were far more than that. They were a symbol of perseverance, of the countless hours spent on the court, perfecting his craft, fighting for every point, every victory. Those shoes carried memories of victory, defeat, and the belief that he could rise above any challenge. They were a part of him, a part of the story that had shaped him into the man standing before the judge. As Michael spoke, his words were measured, calm, but filled with an undeniable sense of resolve. "Judge Hawthorne, I understand that you may find my shoes out of place in your courtroom, but these shoes represent a part of who I am. They are more than just footwear. They are a part of my story, my journey. I have every right to wear them here as much as I have the right to express myself in any manner protected by the Constitution. The First Amendment guarantees me that right. My attire, my shoes, they do not harm anyone. They are a personal symbol, and nothing in the law prohibits me from wearing them." The words hung in the air as the courtroom fell into a tense silence. Michael's argument was clear, concise, and powerful, but he knew that the fight would not end there. Judge Hawthorne, a man who believed deeply in the authority of his courtroom, would not relinquish his control so easily. The tension between them was palpable, a battle between freedom and authority, between individuality and the demands of conformity. The fine was an attempt to crush Michael's spirit, to force him to conform, to wear what was appropriate by the judge's standards, to submit to a narrow view of what was acceptable. But Michael's words were not just about his shoes. They were about a much deeper issue: the right of every individual to exist authentically, without fear of being silenced or punished for what they wear, what they believe, or how they express themselves. The First Amendment was not just a legal concept. It was the foundation of what made America unique. It was a shield for the oppressed, a tool for the marginalized, and a guarantee of freedom for all. As Michael continued, his voice gained strength. "Judge, I understand that you have a duty to uphold order in this courtroom, but I ask you to recognize that true order comes from understanding and respecting the rights of the individuals who enter this space. By imposing this fine, you are not upholding justice. You are suppressing the very freedoms that this country was built on. The law is not just about rules. It's about ensuring fairness, ensuring that no one is discriminated against for their beliefs or their identity." The judge, who had been watching Michael intently, began to shift uncomfortably in his seat. His initial confidence in his position began to waver. Michael wasn't just a famous basketball player, he was a man with a deep understanding of the law and the rights that protected him. He had spent years advocating for justice, fighting for causes that mattered, and here he was once again, standing for what was right. "I am not here to lecture you, Judge," Michael continued, his tone firm but respectful. "But I am asking you to recognize that your judgment, while you're right, may be misguided. This court is meant to uphold justice, not to be a place where personal biases dictate what is allowed and what is not." The room was silent now, and the impact of Michael's words reverberated throughout. His calm, his resolve, his legal knowledge, all of it combined to create a powerful defense, not just of his shoes, but of the rights of every person who had ever been told to fit in or conform. It was a message that transcended the courtroom. It was a reminder that the rights granted by the Constitution were not just theoretical but real, and that they were worth standing up for. Judge Hawthorne, clearly taken aback by Michael's confident defense, hesitated. For a moment he seemed unsure of how to respond. Michael had flipped the script, challenging not just his authority but the very framework of the fine itself. The judge had no legal precedent to stand on, no argument to make against the constitutional rights that Michael had so eloquently defended. The law, as Michael had pointed out, wasn't his alone to interpret. It belonged to everyone, and it was meant to protect their rights, not suppress them. As the judge paused, Michael knew that the battle was far from over. This wasn't just about the fine, it was about something much bigger. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds were against you. It was about ensuring that freedom of expression, no matter how small, no matter how seemingly trivial, was protected. Because if we allowed one small injustice, how could we expect to stand up for the larger ones? The silence in the courtroom was broken only by the sound of Michael's steady breath. He was prepared to fight this fight, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been told that their identity, their expression, or their beliefs were not welcome. His legal genius was not just about his knowledge of the law. It was about understanding the deeper principles that underpinned it and using them to challenge injustice when he saw it. In the end, Michael Jordan wasn't just defending his right to wear basketball shoes. He was defending the very essence of freedom itself, the right of every individual to be who they are, to stand firm in their beliefs, and to express themselves freely in a world that often tries to silence them. And in doing so, he was winning not just a courtroom battle, but a victory for the ideals of liberty and justice that this country was built upon. Legal knowledge and legal precedents. As the tension in the courtroom mounted, Michael Jordan's mind raced, not with worry, but with purpose. He had spent years on the court, both literally and figuratively, learning to think under pressure, to see the angles others missed, and to make calculated moves in the heat of battle. This moment, strangely, almost paradoxically, felt no different. The stakes had shifted from a game of basketball to a battle for justice, but his strategy remained the same. Approach it with intelligence, precision, and, most importantly, an unwavering belief in fairness. When Judge Hawthorne imposed the $500 fine, dismissing his argument with contemptuous authority, Michael understood that he was not just facing a judge's decision, but a moment where the fundamental rights guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution were at stake. The fine wasn't about footwear. It was about something far deeper. An act of legal overreach, an abuse of authority that could threaten the rights of any individual who dared to challenge it. But Michael wasn't just a man of faith and principle. He was also a man of knowledge, and it was that knowledge, grounded in the legal principles that he had studied over the years, that would drive his defense. The First Amendment was the foundation of Michael's response, a shield that had protected generations before him, a shield that he would now wield with precision. In that moment, he remembered the words of Thomas Jefferson, who once said, "The legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others." This was not a case of Michael Jordan harming anyone. The shoes were not a symbol of hate, nor were they a weapon of violence. They were merely an expression of self, and as such, they were protected by the very Constitution that formed the bedrock of American freedom. Judge Hawthorne, however, seemed blind to this simple truth. He was caught in the rigid traditions of his courtroom, the echo of decades of rulings that rarely, if ever, questioned the arbitrary nature of authority. Yet Michael was no stranger to this fight. He wasn't just advocating for himself. He was standing up for the countless people whose voices had been silenced under the guise of order and respectability. He was defending their right to exist in public without being forced to shrink into the shadows of societal expectations. As Michael's mind drifted to the legal precedents that might support his case, he recalled Tinker v. Des Moines, Independent Community School District, 1969, a landmark Supreme Court case that had recognized the right of students to wear black armbands in protest of the Vietnam War. The court had ruled that students did not lose their constitutional rights to freedom of speech and expression at school, and that symbolic speech, like wearing an armband, could not be restricted without substantial justification. Michael had always admired that case, not just for its historical significance, but for its recognition of the importance of personal expression in public spaces. But the Tinker case, though important, was just one example of how the law had evolved to protect the rights of individuals to express themselves. Michael's thoughts moved to another, even more fitting precedent, the case of Church of Lukumi Babalu, IA v. City of Hialeah, 1993. In that ruling, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down a local ordinance that had banned animal sacrifices by a religious group, ruling that the law had violated the First Amendment's protection of religious freedom. The court had firmly held that the government could not discriminate against religious practices unless it could demonstrate a compelling, justifiable reason for doing so. And in this case, Michael saw the parallels to his own situation. The court had ruled that religious symbols could not be banned on a whim, that to do so would be an infringement upon the core tenets of American democracy. Michael's shoes, though not a religious symbol, were similarly a form of self-expression, an extension of his identity. Just as the sacrificial rites were for the church members in Lukumi Babalu IA. With this legal foundation in his mind, Michael felt a surge of confidence. The law was on his side, and he had the knowledge to wield it effectively. As he stood before Judge Hawthorne, he began his argument not with anger or defiance, but with an unwavering belief in the power of the law to correct injustice. "Your Honor," Michael began, his voice steady, "I understand the importance of maintaining decorum in this courtroom. But what is truly at stake here is not the order of your court, but the rights guaranteed to every citizen under the Constitution of the United States. The First Amendment protects the freedom of expression, and that includes the right to wear clothing that represents who we are. These shoes are not a disruption. They are a reflection of my personal journey, a journey that has been defined by hard work, resilience, and overcoming obstacles." The courtroom fell silent as Michael's words echoed through the space. His voice, calm yet powerful, resonated with the weight of history and the depth of his legal understanding. He wasn't just speaking as an athlete, he was speaking as a defender of justice, a man who had taken the time to understand the law and now used that knowledge to challenge a ruling that was clearly unjust. "I am aware of Tinker v. Des Moines, Your Honor," Michael continued. "The court recognized that freedom of expression is not confined to a single form, and that symbolic speech, such as wearing armbands or even clothing, is protected by the First Amendment. If students can wear black armbands in protest without disrupting the classroom, surely a pair of basketball shoes can be worn in a courtroom without disturbing the proceedings." He could see the judge's face shift slightly, a subtle sign that the legal arguments were starting to take root. But Michael wasn't finished. He pressed on, citing Church of Lukumi Babalu IV City of Hialeah, where the court had ruled against a local ordinance that sought to ban religious expression through the act of sacrifice. "Your Honor," Michael said, "you may believe that my shoes disrupt the solemnity of this court, but I ask you to consider the broader principle here. If we allow one person's personal expression to be stifled, we open the door for others to be silenced. The First Amendment was never meant to be limited to speech alone. It is meant to protect all forms of expression." The judge's face turned pale, his grip tightening around the gavel. He had hoped for a quick and easy ruling, a simple punishment for what he perceived as disrespectful behavior. But Michael had thrown the full weight of the law into the ring. He had given the judge no room to hide behind tradition or bias. In that moment, Judge Hawthorne understood that Michael Jordan wasn't just a man wearing basketball shoes. He was a force, a legal genius, whose knowledge of the law and its precedents had turned the courtroom into a battleground for justice. As the judge struggled to regain control of the situation, Michael stood his ground, knowing that the truth and the law was on his side. And in that moment, the power of legal knowledge, the power of understanding the law's true purpose, had taken center stage, leaving the judge to reconsider his authority and his stance on the matter, exposing bias and injustice. The courtroom was silent, the tension hanging thick in the air. Michael Jordan stood at the defendant's bench, still holding his ground despite the intimidating presence of Judge Samuel Hawthorne. The fine had been imposed, but Michael knew that this was no ordinary case. It wasn't just about a $500 penalty. It was about something much deeper. It was about challenging a system that had allowed personal biases to infiltrate and shape decisions, and more importantly, it was about calling attention to the subtle, often invisible ways in which the law could be used to discriminate. From the moment the judge had targeted Michael for wearing his basketball shoes, it was clear that this was about far more than the appearance of decorum in the courtroom. It was about something more insidious, the power of authority being used to silence, to control, and to impose a singular, rigid view of what was acceptable. Judge Hawthorne had been quick to single out Michael, but when Michael began to look around the room, he noticed something that... There, a man sat wearing a t-shirt emblazoned with the words, "I am king," and no one said a word. He was allowed to sit in the same courtroom, undisturbed, without the judge calling attention to his attire. Beside him was a woman with a gaudy, oversized necklace, so shiny it could have been spotted from space, and yet there was no reprimand, no call for her to remove her accessory. It was as if the rules, the expectations of courtroom decorum, applied only to Michael's shoes, a personal symbol that carried meaning, history, and significance. In that moment, something clicked inside Michael. He wasn't just being penalized for wearing basketball shoes. He was being penalized for expressing something that was a part of him, something that was far deeper than the clothes he wore. He was being singled out for his faith, his identity, and the powerful personal story that his shoes told. The judge's behavior had exposed a bias, an inherent unfairness in the system. Michael realized that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger problem, one that ran deeper than this courtroom and this judge. Michael's gaze shifted across the room. He saw the eyes of the other people in the courtroom, the murmurs that had begun to rise in volume, the faint but growing sense of discomfort among the spectators. It wasn't just the unfairness of the situation that was making the room uneasy. It was the recognition of the bias that was playing out before them. It was the glaring inconsistency in the way the judge treated different people based on his own prejudices. Why am I the only one being targeted here? Michael thought to himself. Why is it that my shoes, the same pair I've worn through countless victories, struggles, and triumphs, are deemed so inappropriate while others are allowed to sit here without being questioned? The injustice was clear. Judge Hawthorne wasn't just targeting Michael for his shoes. He was targeting him for what they represented, his identity, his journey, and his refusal to conform to the narrow expectations of what a person should look like or represent in a courtroom. And that, Michael knew, was the true injustice. It wasn't about what he wore. It was about how the law was being used to punish his expression, his faith, and his individuality. For a moment, Michael allowed himself to feel the weight of the situation. It wasn't just personal. It was something far larger. His shoes weren't just footwear. They were a symbol of every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, that their identity was wrong, that their self-expression didn't fit within someone else's idea of propriety. It was the same battle that countless people faced every day, being told to shrink, to hide, to be smaller, quieter, and more conforming to the rigid boundaries of what society or authority deemed acceptable. But Michael wasn't about to let that happen. His voice broke the silence, cutting through the oppressive atmosphere like a blade of truth. "Judge, with all due respect," he began, his voice steady yet filled with resolve, "I am not the only person in this room who is expressing themselves. Why are you not addressing the man over there with the t-shirt that says, 'I am king'? Why are you ignoring the woman with the oversized necklace? Neither of them is being called out for their attire, yet my shoes, a pair of shoes that represent a significant part of who I am, are being singled out." The judge's face darkened. It was clear that Michael had touched a nerve that was tied to his own biases. He had been so quick to judge Michael, to impose his authority, without considering the broader implications of his actions. But now, Michael's calm, deliberate words were forcing him to confront the uncomfortable truth that his actions had been unjust, discriminatory, and based on nothing more than personal prejudice. Judge Hawthorne, his grip tightening on the gavel, tried to deflect. "This is not the point, Mr. Jordan. You are here because of your disrespect for this court. You were warned, and now you face the consequences." But Michael wasn't having it. He wasn't backing down. "I'm not here to challenge your authority, Judge. I'm here to challenge the system that allows this type of bias to thrive. I'm here to make sure that the law is used fairly, impartially, and without the interference of personal beliefs or prejudices. My shoes are not a problem. They are a part of me, a part of my journey, my identity. What's a problem here is that you're treating me differently for expressing something that matters to me, while allowing others to get away with far more disruptive, unprofessional behavior." There was a pause in the courtroom. The judge had no response, no justification for the disparity in treatment. His silence spoke volumes. Michael's words had struck at the heart of what was wrong with the situation, but more than that, they had exposed the core issue of bias in the court system. A bias that had allowed a man to be punished not for his actions, but for his identity. It was a bias that could easily be swept under the rug, hidden behind legal jargon and authority. But not today. Today, Michael Jordan was making sure that this injustice was seen for what it truly was. The room shifted, the energy in the air changing as the people in the courtroom began to process what they had just witnessed. This wasn't just a battle between an athlete and a judge. It was a battle for fairness, equality, and the protection of one's rights in the face of an unjust system. As Michael stood there, his stance unwavering, the weight of his argument lingered in the room. The judge might have had the power to impose a fine, but Michael had the power to expose the truth, and in that moment the bias and injustice that had been hiding in plain sight were no longer invisible. They had been brought into the light, and with them a call for accountability that would resonate far beyond this courtroom. Winning respect and legal victory. As Michael Jordan stood firm in the courtroom, facing Judge Samuel Hawthorne with unwavering confidence, the room was charged with tension. The battle was far from over, and yet, Michael's stance, calm but resolute, spoke volumes. He wasn't simply fighting for the right to wear a pair of shoes. He was standing up for the very principles of justice, fairness, and equality that the law was supposed to protect. The true significance of his actions began to unfold not just in the courtroom, but in the hearts and minds of those watching. Despite the judge's attempt to assert his authority with the $500 fine, Michael remained unshaken. He knew this wasn't a matter of winning a fine or losing a battle over footwear. It was about exposing the inherent flaws in the system, flaws that many others had suffered under, often in silence. In that moment, Michael wasn't just a public figure. He was a defender of rights, a symbol of the power of knowledge and conviction to challenge the status quo. His legal knowledge, combined with his calm demeanor, set him apart from many others who would have backed down under such pressure. As the judge's gaze grew more uncomfortable, Michael's legal argument became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just about the shoes. It was about the constitutional rights he had the courage to defend. His knowledge of the law, specifically the First Amendment, was precise and unwavering. He wasn't just making a case for his own freedom of expression. He was making a case for the broader application of justice for all individuals, regardless of their status or appearance. Michael was standing for a principle that transcended his personal situation, a principle that every person, regardless of background or belief, deserved to have their voice heard and respected. The moment of truth came when Michael, unflinching, demanded that the court review the past 6 months of cases that had involved personal expression and religious symbols. It was a move that would force the judge and the court system to confront its own biases. Michael was no longer just the defendant in the case. He had transformed into the advocate for justice, pushing for change, not just for himself, but for anyone who had been unfairly treated or discriminated against based on personal beliefs, expressions, or identity. His request for a review wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was a call for accountability. Judge Hawthorne, clearly rattled by the force of Michael's argument, began to backpedal. The judge's once confident stance faltered as he realized that he had underestimated the depth of Michael's understanding of the law. In trying to exert control over the courtroom with the imposition of an unjust fine, the judge had inadvertently opened a door for scrutiny that he couldn't close. And Michael, with his quiet but resolute demeanor, had exposed the flaws in the judge's authority and the court's broader practice. Michael's insistence on holding the judge accountable revealed the true nature of his character. This was not a man who had simply accepted the superficial rules of authority. This was a man who believed in the power of truth and the importance of standing up for what was right. Through his actions, he demonstrated that respect in the courtroom, or in any space, was earned not by exerting power or control, but by adhering to principles of fairness, equality, and respect for everyone, regardless of their background or beliefs. By the time the court session ended, it was clear that Michael had not just won a legal victory, he had won the respect of everyone in the room. His calm confidence, his unwavering commitment to justice, and his deep understanding of the law had made an indelible impact on the people present. The courtroom, once a space where authority was unquestioned, had been transformed into a place where the true meaning of justice was put on trial, and the system had failed to uphold it. As Michael left the courthouse, his heart felt lighter. The legal victory, important as it was, felt secondary to the broader message he had sent. In standing up for himself, Michael had stood up for all those who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or discriminated against for expressing their identity, their faith, or their beliefs. He had shown that it was not the strength of one's position or the authority of a figure that mattered. It was the power of knowledge, integrity, and the belief in justice that could truly transform a situation. Michael Jordan's legal victory wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a victory for fairness and equality, and a reminder that true strength lies not in dominance, but in standing up for what is right, regardless of the cost. If you found this story inspiring and thought-provoking, Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories and insightful discussions on justice, freedom, and standing up for what's right. Your support means the world to us. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Comment below with your opinion. How do you think Michael Jordan's stance in the courtroom impacted those around him? What are your views on personal expression and freedom of speech? Let's get the conversation started.